Battle of the Atlantic.
The Battle of the Atlantic was actually a military campaign. It was the longest military campaign of the war, lasting from the start of it, September 3, 1939 to the end, May 8, 1945. It obviously took place in the Atlantic Ocean, but also in some nooks and crannies, such as the Rio de la Plata of Argentina, the Labrador Sea near Newfoundland, the Gulf of Mexico, and German U-boats even went up the St. Lawrence River. The fighting took place mainly between the German and Italian Navy and the German Air Force versus the Canadian Navy, British Royal Navy, and the United States Navy. During the war, Britain was reliant on agricultural and industrial goods from Canada and the United States. Germany tried to cut off the Allied merchant shipping with their large force of U-boats and other vessels. Because of the heavy loss of Allied ships, the supply of them increased so much. Canada's shipbuilding industry increased exponentially. By the end of the war, Canada had the fourth largest navy. We had produced 487 warships, 400 cargo vessels, and more than 3,000 landing craft. The casualties of this battle were heavy, including 70,000 Allied losses, of which 4,600 were Canadian. The Germans had also lost around 30,000 sailors. The outcome was with that of the end of the war, an Allied victory. Dunkirk.
The Battle of Dunkirk, also known as Operation Dynamo or the Miracle at Dunkirk, took place from the 26th of May to June 2, 1940. Germans had come sweeping through the Ardennes forest, dodging the heavily fortified Maginot Line. The French had depended on the Maginot Line and didn't expect the Germans to make such a risky move. They rapidly advanced westward, and then northward, towards the English Channel. This was known as the Sickle Cut, flanking the Allied forces held up in northern France and Belgium. An Allied counter-attack comprised of a small British force and some French against the flank of the German army was made near the town of Arras, in northeastern France. This was known as the Battle of Arras, giving the Allies some vital breathing room. With the rapid advance of the Germans, it was decided the only option was to evacuate to the French port of Dunkirk. For many debated reasons, Hitler had decided to halt the German forces from pushing forward onto Dunkirk. He decided to sign off the destruction of the forces there to the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. The 400,000 troops at Dunkirk were starving, dehydrated, and being attacked by German planes starting at May 29 onwards. The British government rounded up every ship capable of crossing the English Channel, such as pleasure craft, fishing boats, naval vessels, any ship they could find. A major contribution by Canada to support this evacuation was supplying 4 Royal Canadian Navy destroyers. The Allies were only expecting to evacuate around 10,000 troops, but in the end 340,000 of the 400,000 troops were evacuated. This is why the evacuation is also known as the Miracle at Dunkirk. Miracle at Dunkirk.
Battle of Britain.
The Battle of Britain was from July 10 to October 31, 1940. It was a battle where the Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force defended the United Kingdom against the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. At the start, the primary objective for the Luftwaffe was to destroy the Royal Air Force, air bases, naval bases, air and coastal defenses, to protect the invasion force that would follow. Soon after, the terror bombing started. The first bombing on civilians was by accident. 2 German bombers accidentally dropped bombs onto central London. It was reported they made an error, or that they released their load to ensure they had enough fuel to make it home. Either way, 9 people were killed, and in response, the Royal Air Force bombed Berlin. Hitler was enraged by this, and was quoted saying, "Raze their cities to the ground." And that led to the Blitz starting on September 7, 1940. With the Blitz, the Luftwaffe started to put more focus on terror bombing, aiming for places of political significance and densely populated areas to crush British morale. The Blitz lasted 55 nights in a row. The tables began to turn on September 17, 1940. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered. The Royal Air Force had 1,963 aircraft, and the Luftwaffe 2,550. Even with these numbers, the Royal Air Force managed to inflict heavier losses on the Luftwaffe due to advances in radar, and the German planes being at the end of their fuel range. It soon became apparent that the Germans did not have air superiority over the British, which was a very significant factor of the war. Some of the success of the Royal Air Force was due to the training. Many British pilots were enrolled in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. British airmen and other airmen from the Commonwealth were trained in Australia, New Zealand, but most of all, Canada. Canada had churned out 131,533 pilots and aircrew, 72,835 were Canadian. The Battle of Britain had killed 1,542 Allied airmen, and wounded 422. The Germans had lost 2,585 airmen, 925 were captured, and 735 were wounded. These numbers do not compare to the civilian casualties. Overall 50,000 were wounded, and 40,000 were killed. Battle of Hong Kong.
The Battle of Hong Kong took place in Hong Kong, and went from December 8, 1941, to December 25, 1941. As a request from Britain to deter Japanese aggression in the area, Canada had sent 1,975 troops to Hong Kong. These troops were the Royal Rifles of Canada from Quebec City, and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. Combined with the British, Hong Kong, and Indian forces, the Allied strength totaled 13,981 troops. They were severely outnumbered. The Japanese had a force of 29,700 troops, 47 planes, and 10 naval vessels. The Allies were also extremely inexperienced, and poorly trained. All these factors equated to a brutal loss. However, the men were brave and kept fighting even after the Japanese offered surrender. It was impossible for the men to resist a much larger force of experienced soldiers equipped with planes, artillery and naval support. The result was the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong from 1941 to 1945. This battle was significant for Canada, as it was the first place Canadians fought a land battle in World War II. When the British colony surrendered on Christmas Day of 1941, 290 Canadians were killed in the fight, 493 were wounded, and all remaining survivors were taken into captivity. 264 Canadians would die in the inhumane conditions of the Japanese prisoner of war camps. Overall, 2,113 Commonwealth troops were killed, 2,300 were wounded, and the remaining 10,000 were captured.
The Dyer Parade. The Dyer Parade took place on the 19th of August, 1942. The official code name of the raid was Operation Jubilee. The attack was at the town of Dieppe, which was directly in front of a suitable landing beach for Allied forces. The newly allied Stalin was calling to open a second front, and all eyes were looking at the beaches of France. The objective for landed Allies included seizing and holding the port of Dieppe, and to destroy coastal defenses and strategic buildings upon retreat. The fundamental purpose of the raid was to gather intelligence on the German defenses and tactics on the beaches. Over 6,000 infantrymen, primarily Canadian, supported by the Calgary Regiment of the 1st Canadian Tank Brigade, consisting of Churchill tanks and brand new M4 Sherman tanks, stormed the beach. The raid was a disaster. The 9-hour raid cost 3,367 Canadian casualties. The British lost 106 aircraft, 33 landing craft and 1 destroyer. The Germans had also lost 311 men, 280 were wounded, 48 aircraft, and 1 U-boat. The raid had gone horribly due to lack of heavy naval bombardment, air support being only fighters, the plan being compromised to the Germans. The attack ran into a German convoy, no element of surprise, and the beach's pebbly surface trapping Allied vehicles. With the extreme loss, lessons were learned for future battles such as the North African and Normandy landings. Lessons like the need for naval and air bombardment of the defenses. The need to train the troops how to do the landings. The need for extreme secrecy, as will be used in D-Day. Improved communications. And not forcing a beachhead at a heavily defended seaport.
Battle of Ortona.
The Battle of Ortona took place on December 20th, 1943, to December 28th, 1943. The battle was fought solely between the Canadian 1st Infantry Division versus the 2 battalions of German paratroopers in the Italian coastal town of Ortona. These paratroopers were elite and battle-hardened from years of combat experience. The actual battle was claustrophobic and tiring. Soldiers who fought said the battle was like an Italian Stalingrad because of the tightly packed close-quarters combat. To avoid open streets, Canadians are using a strategy of mouse-holing. Soldiers would blast through a wall of a house or adjoining room to avoid the sniper fire on the streets. As the battle went on, it became more and more grueling. The battle turned into house-to-house combat. Each house had to be purged of well-fortified Germans. On Christmas Day, many Canadian soldiers were given a break and brought back to a small liberated church to enjoy Christmas dinner. Some had their dinner delivered to them. After 8 days of fighting on December 28th, the depleted German troops who had no reinforcements finally withdrew from the town. Canadian casualties were heavy in a physical, but also psychological aspect. 1,372 men were killed, 964 wounded, and more than 16,000 suffered battle fatigue, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder. The victory was significant to Canada, as it was purely a Canadian victory. Ortona also had a vital strategic importance in the Italian campaign, as it is one of the few usable deep-water ports on Italy's east coast.
D-Day.
D-Day was the ultimate assault on the beaches of France to start a new front on the European landmass. It took place on June 6, 1944. The attack was also known as Operation Neptune, where troops were to assault the 5 different beachheads of Normandy, and move up to secure a foothold on the town of Normandy. The Allies had a fighting force of 156,000 strong. The Germans had more than 50,350. The assaults on the beachheads were gory. Troops pushed up straight through machine gun fire on heaps of landing craft. They had to push through artillery, machine guns, mines, and booby traps. Many troops lost their lives right on the beaches. Americans were to assault the beachheads Utah and Omaha, the British Sword and Gold, and us Canadians would be attacking Juno. The Canadians pushed forward inland further and faster than anybody else. The only beachheads that met up on the first day were Gold and Juno. However, all beachheads were eventually linked on June 12th. Canada had a major role on this day, as we contributed 110 naval ships with 10,000 sailors, and 15 fighter and fighter bomber squadrons to attack the defenses and control the skies over Normandy. But most of all, we gave the sacrifice at Dieppe to ensure a proper strategy for the attack on Normandy. On D-Day, Canadians suffered 1,074 casualties, including 359 killed. Overall, there had been more than 10,000 casualties, with 4,414 dead, and roughly around 4,000 to 9,000 German casualties.
Liberation of the Netherlands.
3 months after the D-Day landings at Normandy, Canadian forces were given the deadly paramount task of liberating the Netherlands from Nazi occupation. The liberation of the Netherlands was a string of battles that led to victory. As Allied forces were trying to break into Germany, they needed a large harbour to ship supplies. They looked towards Antwerp. Although it had been liberated, the 70-kilometre estuary connected to it was still contested by the Germans. The task to neutralize the estuary was given to the 1st Canadian Army. This estuary was a deadly place to fight in. It was ridden with soggy and flooded land, situated below sea level within a series of dikes. The 1st Canadian Army sent up boats, tanks, and plenty of troops. By the 8th of November, the estuary and its large islands had been secured. The 1st Canadian Army had around 13,000 killed, 6,300 of which were Canadian. In February of 1945, the Allied advance in Northern Europe resumed. The Allies wanted to push the Germans past the Rhine River. The job of clearing the area between the Meuse and Rhine River fell to the 1st Canadian Army, so that the Germans could be pushed over the Rhine. The 1st Canadian Army received tons of reinforcement, including the 1st Canadian Corps who transferred from the battlegrounds of Italy. For the first time in history, 2 Canadian Corps were fighting together. Then in late March, as Allies began crossing the Rhine into Germany, Canada was rooting out the Germans in the Netherlands. The Canadians were greeted as heroes as they liberated towns and cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. Millions of Dutch had been starving from the winter of 1945, and the Canadians seemed like saviors. This is why even to today, Canada and the Netherlands have such a good relationship. And finally, the 1st Canadian Army accepted Germany's surrender in the Netherlands on the 5th of May, 1945. Overall, more than 7,600 Canadians died in the liberation of the Netherlands.